Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today, it's a gray November day. And what does that mean? It's the perfect day to review a gray car. And kind of I won't say a depressing vehicle, but certainly not an overly exciting one, although I do own it and I enjoy it. It's a 1983 Plymouth Gran Fury, and we're going to go over the strange features, quirks, idiosyncrasies, fun stuff, etc. of this vehicle. Now, the Gran Fury was a Chrysler M-body vehicle. The M-body platform was introduced in 1977 and carried on all the way through 1989 in vehicles like not just this Gran Fury, but the Dodge Diplomat and the Chrysler Fifth Avenue. Now, the M-body was really not much of a modification to the F-body, which was effectively the Aspen and Volare that came out in 1976. So this car is effectively an Aspen Volare, and you'll see a number of things related to that. Now, first idiosyncrasy, let's start with not on this particular vehicle because this is the Gran Fury, but if you got the Fifth Avenue, notice the roof line here compared to the Fifth Avenue roof line. On the Fifth Avenues, they put a vinyl top on and they put a fiberglass cap on the back as a cost-effective way to change the rear roof line. And that was something that a lot of car companies did during that time period. Chevrolet did it with the Caprice as well. It's kind of a cheap way to make things look different. Second is just the overall styling of this vehicle. This is a car that if you showed it to a General Motors stylist, they would kind of cringe because there's just so much that is not all that pretty about the styling on this vehicle. This highlight here just doesn't seem quite right. The upper on the vehicle seems very tall. It's almost like it needs about half an inch taken out of the roof height. And it just, this radius here doesn't look quite right. It almost like it wants to be more creased than it is. And it fades out on that rear quarter panel. It doesn't quite fade out on the front fender. So it just looks weird. You can see the fender, it fades out a little bit up here, but it really starts to fade as you get back to the rear quarter panel and you don't notice it nearly as much. So that, and then also this trunk deck lid treatment here, I think would drive a GM person crazy, how the bottom edge of this deck lid is not flush with this. You could have scalloped the taillight out or something a little bit and had the trunk so that you could close it all the way. Now, the amazing thing about this car is that this was designed by the same people, in some cases, that did the first generation LH cars. Tom Gale was actually a stylist on the K car. So it wasn't for lack of talent in the design team. This is just the brief. Now, if you look closely, as I said, this car is a Gran Fury, not a Grand Fury. Gran. An ingenious cost savings that Chrysler came up with, leaving off the D and losing a letter. I wouldn't be surprised if that actually was a business case. And of course you have the mud flaps here that say just Fury. And the wheel covers say Chrysler Corporation. Don't even say Plymouth, they're just generic for Chrysler. Now, out front you have a grille for the Plymouth that spills underneath the headlights, and by this point it's plastic. Chrysler for many years advertised that their grills were still metal, while General Motors went to plastic, but by this point everybody was using plastic, so they couldn't really say that anymore. Next, let's go over and open the door, and you'll notice that this Chrysler is road ready, new vehicle preparation. And on the door panel, there's an interesting piece of trivia here. This is the salon on both of the front door panels. I have no idea why they put that there, but they did. And you have quality engineered Chrysler Corporation on the sill panel. Ooh, Chrysler quality. This instrument panel is basically the same as the Aspen Volare. It has a few little differences in terms of the gauge placement, but the HVAC controls, the glove box, the instrument panel, pad, and everything is the same. They just reused it. Chrysler would also use this wheel on a number of vehicles, including the 81-3 Imperial. Of course, they would leather wrap it there, as opposed to this just being a hard rim. This car does have delay wipers, rear window defroster, AM/FM radio, air conditioning, and that's about it. Doesn't have too many other things. Oh, the 318 V8. They made 130 horsepower in this vehicle. Standard was a 225 cubic inch slant 6, making 90 horsepower. And this car isn't a total dog, but it's definitely not very fast. The rear axle ratio is, I think, 2.2 to 1. It's super lazy. We'll talk about the rear end in a minute, too, because that's something interesting on this car. Let's close the door and talk about the inside for a second. So a number of interesting features and quirks on this. The first is this HVAC setup here, where it's a semi-automatic climate control. It's not fully automatic. You still control the fan speed. You control where the air comes out. But it does have a little door that controls the temperature automatically. So you don't have to put it all the way to the hottest setting. You see it says 85 degrees there. When it's cold, you just leave it at 72 degrees or whatever's comfortable, and it'll automatically adjust. And there's that wonderful Chrysler buzzer. Let's see if you can hear the little motor here as I move this over. Hear it there? There we go. It's basically moving the blend door for the heater core. And by the way, that's the little temperature sensor in there for the semi-automatic climate control. Oldsmobile would have something similar with the Tempmatic. Let me actually put the car in gear here. We're on a flat surface so you can see this better. The other strange thing about this climate control is that notice what it says the activation method is for vent and bi-level. It says push and then pull. What does that mean? Well, you can also see that none of these buttons are pushed in right now because I have the bi-level activated. If you want heat, you just depress that and notice it locks in. If you want maximum AC, you depress that. You want defrost, you press that. If you want bi-level, you push this. If you want the air conditioning compressor to be on. If you want the air conditioning compressor off and you want bi-level, then you pull it back out. Same with the vent. This would be normal air conditioning, and if you want it to just be vent, you pull it back out. These two buttons here have little, see, you can see that in the top, a little tang here where you can pull it back out. These are more smooth, the other buttons. It would be hard to do that, but this is an interesting approach to the HVAC control that Chrysler used for quite a few years. Now, another interesting thing about this is if you have one of these cars and your air mode door doesn't work, which was true on this car, chances are your connector that's underneath this panel here is broken. So if you take this panel off, you're going to see a connector and a bunch of vacuum hoses going into it and out of it. And that's what controls all the mode doors. And for whatever reason, those connectors just crumble. They're not made out of a very robust plastic. So all you have to do is take off the vacuum hoses and then connect them to one another, and you'll restore the system functionality. And that's exactly what I did in this car. When I got it, the mode door wouldn't move. Now it moves just fine. No issues. As I said, this is the same instrument panel as the Aspen and Volare. But you do have another interesting quirk on these vehicles that when you turn the key on, take a look at, this is the oil pressure light here. Notice you can barely read it. Something has fallen there that doesn't allow you to read it. That is true for all of these cars. I don't know what falls behind there, but I've only seen that on, I think actually every one of these that I've seen has that issue. So interesting little quirk on these vehicles. Next you have the sun visors that notice there's no clip in here. It's just free. So this actually is fine. It doesn't jiggle, but Chrysler's put a pretty stiff spring in here to keep the visor up and so it doesn't jiggle. And GM did that too. The 77 Impala, as an example, didn't have that clip for the visor, but I just thought that was interesting. Not all vehicles had that. You also have a bit of a head pillow back there, in the rear C-pillar for the rear passengers, something that Imperial had for a number of years. Frankly, I'm surprised it's on this car, but it's a welcome feature if you're sitting in the back seat. Next, let's pop the hood and take a look at the 318 V8. And before we go there, we'll find another interesting feature here. Look at how they finished this off, or they didn't, this door panel. It looks absolutely terrible. Of course, you don't see it when the door is closed, but still. All right, under hood. First thing to note, notice Chrysler uses torsional springs here on their hood hinges to lift the hood. It works just fine, and my guess is it was probably cheaper than the big old spring, but no complaints. And here's your 318. I will tell you one quirk about these vehicles. If you have to change the coil, where is it? No, it's not there, but the distributor cap is there. It's tucked down there. I had to change it on this car because it was going bad, and that was not fun. Not horrible, but not fun. You also got on Chrysler's this battery thermo guard that was supposed to protect your battery and give it a bit longer life and make starts easier in the winter. And frankly, it works. This battery has lasted a long time. It doesn't drain. I think this battery is probably 10 years old. So works just fine. By the way, this car also has its own unique quirk, and this is a wax coating on here. And the wax coating is courtesy of Rusty Jones. So that's why it's discolored. You can see here I just cleaned this area off so you can see what it looked like absent that wax coating. Next, we have Chrysler's electronic fuel control system, a variation of the lean burn setup. It was introduced in the mid-1970s. This spark control computer here basically controls the ignition timing, and you can see it has a vacuum hose going to it. This is a feedback carburetor as well on this, and there are metering rods that move up and down to make the mixture rich or leaner. So this was one of the early emission systems, and Chrysler kind of pioneered this. By this point, it was a relatively robust system. Sometimes these brain boxes do go out, but overall pretty reliable. On the lean burns, though, it is jetted very lean, the carburetor is, and as a consequence, the fast idle's on quite a bit. Even if you shut the car off for about 5 minutes, you go to start it back up, the fast idle will be on. And the ignition timing on these is also computer controlled. The longer that you drive with your foot with your foot on the gas pedal, the more ignition timing the engine will receive. And when you take your foot off the gas at closed throttle, the computer actually counts down and starts retarding the timing more and more and more, so that if you're in city traffic, the car is going to feel actually boggier than if you just came off the freeway and drove it for about 10 minutes. It'll feel much peppier when you first take off from a stoplight, because the computer has the spark advance much higher than what it is if you were just idling around town. Again, the computer gives the engine more advance for every 30 seconds, I believe, that it detects a non-closed throttle condition, up to a certain maximum, obviously. And then when you take your foot off the gas, every, I think, 10 seconds, it starts retarding the timing back further and further and further. So that was how Chrysler did it on these vehicles. I guess it works, but it does make these feel a little boggy. I've made mine, I call it my non-lean lean burn. On these Carter 2-barrel carburetors, there's a top access plate that you can take, I think, 3 or 4 screws off, remove the access plate, and you can see the metering rods, and you can adjust them richer or leaner. So I've adjusted these to the full rich setting, and the car runs way better. So a little tip for you. And I don't detect any gas smell, and the tailpipe is clean, and it runs way better than the metering rods actually in their stock position. Next, we have the suspension setup on this vehicle. Notice there are no coils. Where are the coils? on here. It doesn't exist. These Aspen Villari based M bodies have transverse torsion bar front suspension and single leaf rear spring. So that's the suspension right there, the in effect unwound spring. That's one of the transverse torsion bars. And there's two of them. There's one on either side. So that was an interesting approach. Chrysler had torsion bar front rear leaf spring suspension for many, many years, all the way back into the late 50s. And they wanted to preserve that. And what's funny about this M body is that it actually rides just like a full-size Chrysler. I have a 72 New Yorker. This car rides just like it, almost identical. For better or worse, all the good things and all the bad things. It handles great. The car does not roll over in turns. It doesn't lean at all. But it's a pretty stiff ride. And that's a consequence of these torsion bars, because unlike the coil springs where you have to take up a little bit of the slack before they really do much, the torsion bars pretty much instantly activate. So if you want a good handling car, get one of these. And maybe that's why the Michigan State Police selected these, and a lot of municipalities did for their police vehicles, because they handled very well. And these were tough vehicles. The engine in these, the 318, if you had a police car, it was a 4-barrel. The Slant 6 also was a tough engine. The transmissions, the torque flights were tough. There was one Achilles heel, though, and that is this teeny-weeny rear end. This car has a Chrysler 7.25-inch rear differential. It's teeny. So that's the Achilles heel of the whole drivetrain on these vehicles. In other words, don't peel out, which is hard to do anyway because there's not much power in these. And don't drive them on snow or ice where one wheel's slipping and then all of a sudden grabs. That will give you problems. If you just kind of obey those rules, then you'll be okay. But that is the weak point of the entire driveline, is that rear end. Another interesting feature is if this were a cop car, this striker would actually be reinforced so that the rear passengers couldn't kick on the door and force it open. And a lot of these were cop cars. Plymouth only sold 15,000 of these Gran Furies, most to municipalities, taxi cabs, police cars, fleet vehicles. But they're tough little cars. And if you want to get a good used car, get a car that was selected for police duty or taxi cab duty, like a Crown Vic or one of these, because they generally are quite tough. And before we take it for a ride, just a few other little quirks. You'll notice here, just the way this roof is formed, you can kind of see the ripples on this crease here. And if you could run your finger over this, you'd see there's a divot here almost. It's just really not great quality from Chrysler during this period. The poor company didn't have much money. But I gotta say, the car drives really well. Let's take it for a drive. It's a pleasant cruiser. Here we go. All right, here we go. Oh yes, key buzzer. The heat feels good. Cold day here. And the fast idle's on, as I mentioned, because of the wonderful lean mixture, even though I've been driving this car quite a bit today. And we're off. You can hear the transmission has a first gear whine, as did some other cars of the era. GM and Ford, as well as Chrysler. And I have to say, despite this 2.2 to 1 rear end, the 318's got some good little scoot in first gear. Part of that is, as I said, I'm running the non-lean lean burn. But man, this car is just fun. It drives like a little go-kart. It feels like a much smaller car than it is. These cars listed for about $8,500 new, And it was a great value, I have to say. This was the same base price as a Chevrolet Celebrity, if you can believe that. And it was about $100, $150 cheaper than an Impala. The Celebrity was actually a relatively expensive car. It had a base price that was more expensive than the mid-size Malibu in 1983, which I think the base price was about $8,000. So that's kind of where this slotted in the overall lineup of things. All right, and we're off. First thing I have to say is, compared to other Chrysler products, in particular the fuselage cars, the interior noise levels in this vehicle are not offensive. I wouldn't call them best in class, but it's pretty quiet, actually. No issues taking a long trip in this car. Not a lot of wind noise, not a lot of road noise. As I said, not the quietest car, but it's far from being loud. It would be perfectly adequate, if not even a little more than that, on a long trip. The ears would not tire of it. The other impression I get getting into this after one of the big land yachts is just how well this thing handles. Chrysler always made good handling cars in the modern era, really owed to that torsion bar front suspension, and this is no different. The fuselage era cars also are good handlers. So if that's what you're looking for, get a Chrysler. If you want a mushy ride, which I also love, get a Ford product. You want in between, get a GM. Now this is a 3-speed torque flight with lockup, and it just goes into lockup at 45. And unlike the GM and the Fords, if you depress the brake pedal, the lockup doesn't disengage. Not quite sure how Chrysler got away with that. Ford got into trouble on its vehicles for a while because if you slammed on the brakes and locked the rears, you'd stall the engine. That's why a lot of the 80s era cars, if they have a torque converter with a lockup solenoid, they disengage when you let your foot off the gas. But this lockup disengages automatically at 45. Of course, if you floor it, it'll disengage too. And then it just re-engages as you hit 45, almost irrespective of what the throttle position is, unless it's pretty far down. But just a very pleasant ride. Comfortable seat, lots of room, great value for $8,500. Hard to go wrong. And if you see one of these, I picked this up. It's got 11,000 miles. I think when I bought it, it had 10. Picked it up for like $3,500. How could I resist? And it's been a good, reliable car. I think I've had it 4 years. I really just had to put a new coil on it. I recharged the AC. The shift rod for the transmission, the plastic bushing, had broken, and so it upshifted way too early and wouldn't downshift. But I put a new bushing in, reconnected the shift rod, and now it works great. You can see my skin knuckles from changing that coil. It's not a fast car by any stretch. Yeah, this is floored. So you're not going to win any drag races. I am going uphill, but still. Hope you enjoyed this look at this 83 Gran Fury. Thanks again for watching.